invitation. I'm looking forward to all of our conversations. This is our first time in South Africa, and so far it has been a really wonderful and eye-opening experience, and we're hoping to be able to come back again in future. I'm going to talk this morning for about 20 to 25 minutes, I think, about sign actions in the books of Jeremiah and Ezekiel. Jeremiah and Ezekiel, as I'm sure you'll know, two of the major prophetic books in the Hebrew Bible that came out of the trauma of exile and deportations around the fall of the kingdom of Judah in the 6th century. And so I'd like to talk a little bit about how I think some of the trauma of migration has come through in the way that Jeremiah and Ezekiel communicate through their bodies, through their sign acts. So the books of Jeremiah and Ezekiel are replete with sign acts. The parameters of that particular prophetic genre, the genre of the sign act, are disputed. What exactly counts as a sign act, what does not. It's clear that there are more sign acts associated with Jeremiah and Ezekiel respectively than there are sign acts involving all of the other so-called writing prophets, so Isaiah through Malachi, all of those other prophets combined. Various people tally the number of sign acts in each of these books in slightly different ways, but Jeremiah and Ezekiel in every tally stand out as really having very significant numbers of these phenomena. My contention is that this concentration of sign acts is not coincidental. Rather, it reflects these traditions' origins in the traumatic experiences of the 6th century BCE. As Julie was alluding, these two books are by now widely recognized as major loci of the traumas associated with the demise of the kingdom of Judah and its capital Jerusalem, with widespread death, displacement, and deportation, quite characteristic of that historical moment and its aftermath. Contemporary evidence from the social sciences indicates that difficulty with language and the substitution of somatic or bodily expression as a way of communicating is quite common amongst people who have experienced traumatic events of that kind. So far, a handful of trauma-informed biblical scholars have made some passing comments, noting or linking particularly Ezekiel's sign acts to traumatic experience or traumatic expression, but this exceptional preponderance of sign acts in Jeremiah and Ezekiel have not been connected so explicitly to the traumatic experiences of the 6th century. The kind of the material I'd like to work through this morning is an attempt to interpret that material in a fairly sustained way in conversation with recent literature from trauma studies. So we'll start with some material about language and thinking about the way that language manifests in these books, and then we'll look at somatization, bodily expression, and the way that manifests in the books. So traumatic experience, as I'm sure many of you already know, can prompt a wide variety of atypical or considered atypical behaviors. And the type and severity of these vary depending on the prior mental and physical state of the victim, the availability of social and psychological support networks, and local cultural expectations regarding the expression of acute distress. One of the most well-documented expression of traumatic experience or atypical behavior associated with traumatic experience has to do with language. Insofar as trauma stands outside of the normal range of human experience, it is very common to find survivors of trauma struggling to talk about what has happened to them, struggling to talk about their experience. There we go. Wonderful. How do I move? I can do it here?
You need to probably
I have to tell you. Okay. Which means I now have to remember. No, that's okay. I was just going to roll without it. Okay. There's the sort of various enumerations of numbers of sign acts in various different prophetic texts. You can see that Jeremiah and Ezekiel pop out quite notably. I think we're on. So there's this one, sign acts and trauma. So here's a couple of the authors who had kind of noted some of these associations. So here we are, trauma in the body. Excuse me. No, back up actually two. Sorry, trauma and language. Go back two slides. There we are. Trauma and yes, I think this is where we're. Okay, so a growing body of research, some of which you can see some kind of fragments from here, suggests that linguistic issues are quite common, and that they're not purely problems of the mind, but that they're linked intimately to the effects of trauma on the body, as trauma disrupts the brain's ability to linguistically and logically organize its experience. Whatever the precise mechanisms of the phenomenon, it's now widely recognized that a common social response to traumatic past event is silence and inhibition. And that is true across a very wide range of traumatic experiences, including war, natural disasters, as well as experiences of personal violence, such as rape. Next slide. Trauma-induced language issues are pervasive in both Jeremiah and Ezekiel. Perhaps the most obvious is the thrice repeated report of Ezekiel's mutism in chapter 3, chapter 24, and in chapter 33. Now, the practicalities of Ezekiel's silence in a book that appears to contain a lot of words communicated via Ezekiel has been the subject of much discussion. But whatever the kind of mechanics of this are envisioned to be, this reference to Ezekiel's mutism is a prominent and profound acknowledgement of the chasm between the lived experience of Judah's downfall and the capacity of even prophetic language to describe that experience in words. Another indication of that these books reflect a trauma-induced struggle with language is the way that they tend to talk around the prophets and their community's experiences, rather than expressing them directly. So Ezekiel's opening vision in chapter 1 offers an immediate example as soon as we begin the book. Struggling to find words adequate to describe his experience, Ezekiel resorts to a litany of similes. He sees something like gleaming amber, something like 4 living creatures, something that looks like burning coals of fire, and so on, and so on. And the book of Ezekiel thereafter is saturated with allegory and metaphor, artistic circumlocutions that seek to convey traumatic experience by telling it slant, in the words of Emily Dickinson. The so-called Song of the Sword in chapter 21 is famously incomprehensible, and commentators have proposed all manner of emendations and reorganizations in their efforts to render it even so much as translatable. Commenting wryly on Yahweh's suggestion that Ezekiel is to use plain speech in chapter 3, verses 4 to 7, Jacob Myers remarks that, in fact, Ezekiel presents the most obscure and difficult display of language in all of Scripture. Ordinary language simply will not do. And in hunting for words capable of expressing the trauma of defeat and deportation, Ezekiel resorts to Hebrew's furthest reaches. That Jeremiah also struggles with words is even more widely recognized. The book is notoriously repetitive, and the body of the book is a frustrating agglomeration of poetry and prose that leaps from topic to topic and from form to form, with the barest semblance of coherence. The book is littered with marginally coherent exclamations such as hoy and oi, whoa, groans that express a profound loss of hope, purpose, and identity. Thank you. At the same time, both Jeremiah and Ezekiel struggle with words to the point of excess. The Masoretic text of Jeremiah is the longest book in all of the Hebrew Bible, and Ezekiel is not far behind. Both outstrip the book of Isaiah by several thousand words, despite Isaiah's century-plus head start. Because Hebrew is typically, indeed notoriously laconic, these books' surfeit of words is especially striking, as they attempt to describe experiences that are fundamentally indescribable. They end up spewing verbiage in all directions. Both are plagued also with textual and transmissional difficulties from the micro level to the macro. In the latter end, the climactic chapters at the end of Ezekiel 1 to 39, for example, are organized differently in the Greek manuscript P967 than they are in the Masoretic tradition. Jeremiah's oracles against the nations appear variously in the middle of the book or at the end of the book, depending on the version. Both books also have quite high rates of hapax legomena, words that appear nowhere else in Scripture. Frequently minor, but nevertheless pervasive differences between the Hebrew Vorlage of the Greek Jeremiah version of Jeremiah and the extant Masoretic version, Hebrew Masoretic version, further suggests that efforts to convey the incomprehensible events of the kingdom's destruction in something resembling comprehensible language continued to demand scribal attention for decades, if not for centuries. Next slide, I think. Yes. So we'll turn now towards trauma in the body. So if words are an inadequate or an inaccessible communicative instrument for the trauma survivor, what alternatives are there? Trauma itself suggests one possibility. Etymologically, the word originates as the Greek term for a physical wound. Clinically referred to as somatization, the physical symptoms of trauma can manifest in a variety of ways, including gastrointestinal issues, vomiting, paralysis, amnesia, headaches, double vision, dizziness, fatigue, and muscular or joint pain. The precise symptoms, the way that they're communicated, and the way that they're treated are influenced by a wide range of physical, social, cultural, and psychological factors. Sometimes traumatized persons will even reenact the traumatic event, usually without being fully aware that what they're doing is, in fact, a repetition of their earlier experience. Now, relevant to our 6th century context is that multiple traumas may progressively lower the threshold for the development of somatic symptoms. Jerusalem's eventual surrender to the Babylonians was the culmination of decades of political instability that had been accompanied by an array of national security threats. These were years that saw multiple sieges on the city of Jerusalem, one of which lasted for more than a year and resulted in widespread starvation and death. And both of those sieges, both in 597 and culminating in 597 and culminating in 586, both of those resulted in the forced deportation of significant numbers of people. Within the homeland, there were widespread internal displacements, kind of within Judah's borders, and refugee movements, also regionally back and forth across the Transjordan, as families sought to evade first the incoming Babylonian army and then the consequences of imperial rule. The sacred precincts of the temple in Jerusalem were invaded and plundered by the Babylonians, and much of the city went up in flames. Although this picture is sketched by the biblical texts only in its broad and largely communal outlines, these texts depict a generation that was repeatedly exposed to opportunities for trauma. Somatic symptoms appear remarkably consistently in the wake of war and violent trauma of this kind. Perhaps especially striking is the marked association between the development of somatic symptoms and experiences of dead body handling. Although exact numbers are unknown, Jerusalem's death toll in the wake of the sieges would have been significant. The Book of Lamentation makes various allusions to significant numbers of dead and dying. And estimates of death rates during Middle Eastern involuntary migrations in the 18th and 19th centuries CE, so this side, range from 20 to 50%. So as a sort of a rough frame of reference for the sheer numbers of people who probably died in the experience of the forced deportations to Babylonia, we might think in some fairly significant numbers. Interaction with corpses may have been especially traumatic for those with priestly connections, as both Ezekiel and Jeremiah are said to have, because dead bodies, according to Levitical tradition, rendered those in contact with them ritually unclean. Somatic manifestations of trauma also appear to be more prevalent amongst refugees than non-refugees, and both Jeremiah and Ezekiel attest to repeated involuntary migration in connection with Jerusalem's destruction. I'm not sure what the next slide is, actually. Perfect. Almost. So why traumatic experience can affect the body in these kinds of ways is not very well understood, although recent research in the medical and social sciences has made some helpful suggestions. One explanation connects somatization to the language problems that I was discussing earlier, and suggests that memories of traumatic events end up laid down in the body because they can't be processed via language. So they have to go somewhere, and because they can't come out via language, they end up in the body instead. So when trauma leaves an individual in a state of speechless terror, this is kind of one of the very common phrases associated or used to describe trauma, in which words fail to describe what's happened to a person. Traumatic memories are then stored in sensory perceptions, obsessional ruminations, or as behavioral reenactments. Another possible explanation or concomitant explanation relates to the way that the body responds to extreme stress, and suggests that somatic symptoms may derive from the permanent state of arousal in the autonomic nervous system. So the autonomic nervous system is the one that's responsible for fight or flight. And in trauma survivors, it tends to not shut down after the experience. So normally, sort of a normal, stressful, alarming situation, that sort of rush of adrenaline, to fight or to run away. But once the danger is past, what should happen is that the adrenaline should subside, and our bodies return to normal. After, in the wake of traumatic experience, that system doesn't necessarily shut down properly, and so the body continues to be flooded with the sort of the hormones and the chemicals. And that has been suggested as a possible source of the body's subsequent symptoms in various kinds. And then, last but not least, and with a mind especially to some of Ezekiel's behavior, in its most extreme form, the body's defensive response to danger is simply to freeze. Medically, this is called tonic immobility. It's a way of feigning death in order to hope that the source of the threat, the thing that might want to eat you in the animal world, might lose interest and go away. So a way of sort of, and it's most well attested, it's very well observed in the animal kingdom, that an animal, in threat of being attacked by a lion, falls down and acts like they're dead, because most animals don't want to eat things that are already dead. Some do, but in which case, not going to help. But so especially well documented in humans, but it has also been observed amongst humans. And perhaps the most well-known example that many of you have probably heard of is when a rape victim will recall not being able to respond, not being able to fight back or move in the midst of an assault. And notably, and in that context, this is a fairly strong association. That kind of immobilization at the time of the original trauma is associated with particularly strong psychological consequences thereafter, including feelings of shame, contempt for self, self-blaming. I should have fought back, and so. And a similar sort of involuntary immobility can also be re-triggered by later reminders of the original traumatic situation. Okay. Perhaps most striking are cases in which traumatized persons under threat of additional trauma withdraw from the world entirely, and progressing from reduced speech and loss of appetite to complete or near complete unresponsiveness. One of the particularly famous case studies or set of case studies relevant to our discussions today are children of refugees if I recall rightly, it's Sweden, where when the family was under threat of deportation back to the homeland, the children progressively went into a state of tonic immobility, and doctors can't find anything externally or physically wrong with the children, but they only come out of this state when the deportation order is lifted, and it's been attested in a few different kinds of contexts, also in Australia. So this sort of shutting down in response to renewed threat. Excuse me. All right, now somatization in Ezekiel. The fact that traumatic experiences can manifest themselves in the body somatically like this, especially in the aftermath of war and involuntary flight, sheds light, I think, on a number of aspects of Jeremiah and Ezekiel's own efforts to communicate. At the broadest level, trauma-induced somatization explains the sheer volume of bodily language in these two books. There is more body language in these two books with greater intensity than anywhere else in the prophetic literature. So in addition to the material typically considered synax, Ezekiel resorts to intense and physically graphic allegories as it attempts to describe what's happened and what will happen to Jerusalem in Ezekiel 16 and 23. So those are those extended allegories describing Jerusalem and Samaria as promiscuous women in extreme and graphic detail. Ezekiel 22 deals with the physical experiences of violence, suffering, and pain by describing the consequences of the siege of Jerusalem and exile, and in explicitly bodily terms, with a number of references, particularly to bloodshed and bodiness. Corpses pile up. This is just, I mean, this is a kind of a short list of some of the body language, but to give you a sense. So corpses pile up in chapter after chapter. Past transgressions are described as failures of the body. House of Israel has a hard forehead and a stubborn heart. How sick is your heart that you did all these things? And the future depends on an organ transplant. I will give them one heart and put a new spirit. I will remove the heart of stone from their flesh and give them a heart of flesh. Likewise, in Jeremiah, and I think this is the next slide now. There we go. Okay. Bodies are everywhere. Dead bodies, diseased bodies, leaking bodies, bloody bodies. Both of these books also focus on the prophetic personae in ways that the other prophetic books don't. And again, Jeremiah scholars in particular have focused on the way that Jeremiah's life and physical person are used to communicate suffering. Jeremiah remains unmarried and childless as a sign of the destruction of the kingdom's families. He buys a field in Anathoth as a promise that houses and fields and vineyards will again be bought by the people. Jeremiah is imprisoned in a pit from which he's unable to escape, just as the people are trapped in the city by the Babylonian siege. And later, Jeremiah is taken out of the country by force, just as many of his compatriots also had been. As Corey Carvalho has memorably described it, Jeremiah's body is the stage on which Jerusalem's urban disaster is enacted. Ezekiel, for his part, also bears the horrors of Jerusalem's siege in his person, day after day after day. The infamous synax in chapter 4, where Ezekiel lies on one side for 350 or 150 days, depending on the Greek or the Hebrew. And then on his other side, his hair goes the way of Jerusalem's inhabitants. It's cut off and scattered and destroyed. Jeremiah crawls through a wall in chapter 12, enacting the frantic flight of Jerusalem's past and future refugees. The dismantling of Ezekiel's priestly identity in Ezekiel 4 and 5 likewise mirrors the dismantling of his fellow deportees' identities. They've survived the disaster, but have not yet resolved its consequences into a coherent account of the self. Both Jeremiah and Ezekiel are forbidden from mourning, which I find especially striking given that a failure to grieve appropriately is one of the things that inhibits the resolution of trauma. That's in Jeremiah 16 and Ezekiel 24. Both of these books quite overtly acknowledge that they resort to embodied forms of communication as a result of words failure. So both Jeremiah and Ezekiel are each described as consuming the word that they are given from God. And so they transfer the unspeakable divine words concerning the kingdom's doom directly into their bodies, from which and through which they can subsequently be expressed. That's in Jeremiah 15 and Ezekiel 2:2-3. In the topsy-turvy world of trauma, words enter the body instead of leaving it. And these images of prophets ingesting Yahweh's words echo what trauma researchers already know, that language and body are interrelated. So the bodies of the prophets become the surfaces on which these books' messages are written. The body is pressed into service as a communicative instrument that does not require words, so that it functions as a mediating symbolic device that stands in the breach where words cannot go. Through the body, in lieu of words, the prophet is able to press against the limits of discourse. Through the body, the prophet is able to convey a message beyond the semiological capacity of words alone. Jeremiah and Ezekiel so characteristically communicate the traumas of the kingdom's demise through their bodies because language proves, despite their long-winded efforts, an inadequate means of communicating the horror of what has and what will befall Jerusalem and its people. So to sum up, the bodies of Jeremiah and Ezekiel, as depicted in the books that bear their names, are embodied witnesses to the lasting consequences of traumatic violence. The syntax with which they are associated represent remarkable efforts to communicate in a world beyond the capacity of ordinary vocabulary to describe. In the face of words' failure, the communicative potential of the body comes to the fore. The traumas that cannot be expressed in words are expressed instead through the body. And again, a few scholars have suggested a connection between the prophetic syntax and trauma, but this particular prevalence of syntax in Jeremiah and Ezekiel, I contend, should be specifically connected to the traumatic aftermath of the kingdom's demise. My goal here has been to make explicit and to clarify the connection amongst traumatic experience, linguistic inhibition, and then overtly bodily forms of communication, and to argue that the unusual prominence of syntax and other somatic phenomena in these two books in particular should be traced to the language difficulties that are characteristic of trauma survivors and the development of somatic bodily expressions and phenomena as an alternative means of communication. Thank you very much. I'm happy either, I don't know whether we're going to have conversation now or we're all going to talk and then we're going to take questions.
So yes, so thank you also to those colleagues who are joined us online. So you're also welcome to ask questions, and I can see the few questions there. So anybody questions?
Everyone's stunned into silence and listening like Ezekiel. Hopefully not traumatic.
So Carly, there is a way in which the performance of the prophetic office of these two persons, Jeremiah and Ezekiel, but also their vocation, if you look at the stories, they're already bodily conscripted from the very beginning. So we're kind of asking a chicken and egg type of question. Because it does seem, if you start to read from the very beginning with the alertness that you're bringing here, this stuff is already already there. So are they in some sense representative of the actual trauma, because the entire population is traumatized?
Yeah.
Or are they in some ways just, I wouldn't say uniquely, but or their performance then enacts the trauma? If you see the difference,
I think so. I think so. I mean, I think both. So I think they are certainly representative of the wider traumas of the people. And I mean, of course, one of the challenges of trying to say anything about about Jeremiah or about Ezekiel is the fact that everything we know about Jeremiah or Ezekiel, assuming that they were real persons, is mediated through literature and through the literary representation of those prophets. And so, we can say that Jeremiah, the individual prophet, or Ezekiel, the individual prophet, was also traumatized based on the descriptions of them that are given in the books. But there is a really blurry boundary between the depiction of the prophets as individuals and their function as representatives or mediators of the community more widely, including their traumatic experiences. I mean, you point already to sort of the from their very function as prophets. I mean, I think one of the things that's perhaps interesting or notable about these two prophets especially is that in the context of their call narratives or the descriptions of them becoming prophets, those experiences seem to be in some way traumatic, depicted as traumatic. Jeremiah, infamously has these running arguments back and forth with Yahweh over, I am not happy about this whole prophetic calling. I don't want to do this, but you won't let me not. And so, I mean, we could kind of articulate that as sort of a further traumatization or becoming a prophet is itself in some way traumatic. Yeah. In another conversation I was having about some of this work recently, we were talking about also the overlap with any attempt to communicate the divine is, like trauma, at some level inexpressible. So that there is this sort of, again, these bleeding boundaries between the inexpressibility of trauma and the inexpressibility of divine knowledge of the divine word, that also kind of weaves its way into the depiction of these prophets and their experiences or their attempts to communicate. So.
Anyone else? Well, I was just struck again. I mean, just in terms of a larger conversation, also about thinking about migrants as individuals and personnel. There's, I mean, probably also a bit like the poem in the beginning, but I mean, just the effects of that on the body. If the body keeps a score, or just how. I mean, what so easily. Sort of could say it's problematic behavior, or don't understand some of the acts of behavior. But I mean, the coming out of how that trauma for years, and also then are carried over from parents to children intergenerational. I think the biblical texts help us, and reading through this lens help us to just be more cognizant of what migrants experience, whatever your status, it's traumatic moving spaces, moving lives. But I mean, even more so in terms of the intersection of class, and then also the gender, which is a whole.
Yeah, certainly.
As well, so.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think one of the particularly powerful theological contributions of these prophetic books within the wider canon is to represent that kind of experience to the contemporary context, and particularly in some ways. So both for those for whom these kinds of experience resonate personally, who have had traumatic experiences or have migrated, to see those experiences reflected within Scripture. For those who haven't had those kinds of experiences, also to in some ways be almost forced to confront those experiences as part of the tradition. One of the things you mentioned, kind of the further aspect of gender. I mean, one of the things that I didn't really kind of delve into here, but it's been playing on my mind, is the way that both Jeremiah and Ezekiel also, in their prophetic personae, bend gender expectations in various ways, and thinking about to what extent that is also tied into traumatic experience, the disruption of normal expectations, whether that's of what home is or where home is, and ideas about safety, but also about the presentation of the self itself.
But also the migration experience, because I mean, it unsettles some of the traditional ways.
It does, exactly.
Society works. So I do think this, for better or for worse. Also.
Yeah, exactly, for better or for worse.
Good. I'm going to give over to Steve. So thank you so much.
Yes. So you need to just out there. Maybe the camera. We want to put the camera in front of you. So. Okay, there you go. Perfect.
Okay. Works. All right. Well, Julie, thank you for organizing this and inviting me to be a part of the mischief of academic work. I mean, one of that being we've gathered you here today in the middle of your holiday break, and it gives us who were in the area an opportunity to extend our stay and justify why we're doing so with some work. So my co-collaborators in this mischief, Carly and Chris, thanks for also being there. So I want to talk on the topic trauma storytelling and generativity and obscurity, and to do so from the perspective of the book of Ruth. The book of Ruth reveals several clues about its purpose in its opening sentence. The fourth historical setting, the days when the judges ruled, ties the narrative to governance, so that shouldn't be surprised that at the end it's about the governance of the nation of Israel. But that these days were short, chaotic, and in the minds of some, ushered in the monarchy prepares the reader for a foundational story of kinship. The second clause situates the story in the context of national, or at least regional disaster. A famine in the land is presented as in a matter of fact way, without the details of the disastrous effect that food shortages can have upon the vulnerable. That the writer pays such short attention to the potential for precarity in this introduction suggests the story is only going to background the disaster rather than foreground it. The figuration of famine makes sense by the time we get to the third clause of the sentence. The story is about a man, despite the seductions of the single female name that heads the book. The biography of this man connects with these two clauses and prepares the reader for what is a typical male narrative. So before we hear the man's name, we already know him as a man with resources. The terse 3 Hebrew word description of the famine, followed by the word so full of agency, yelek, prepares us to read a story like a man like many others in the Hebrew Bible. This man has the resources in the midst of famine to get up and to move. So Ruth opens as a story about men with resources who travel. The question that faces the reader then, what type of travel, what type of migration, what type of movement is this book about? And we put all of these things together. Kingship, famine, maleness. What does it mean when you have a book titled with a woman's name? So I want to explore then several related matters about the book of Ruth, among them issues of trauma and migration, obviously, but to think about the confluence of trauma and migration at this stage in our common human existence raises the images of the fragile environments that impact the world in disproportionate ways. Because the migratory patterns that take place in our modern world is largely among the poor and the disenfranchised, even though the very public conversation seems to assume people with resources who just decide to move, like us, right? and there are ways in which I'll talk about that. And so what gets foregrounded in modern discourse are people who can choose to move and move fairly seamlessly versus the ones who are forced into movements. And of course, what that does is to muddy the public conversation, and certainly within the United States, the legal conversations, because legality suppresses the cause, impact, and potential solutions generated by trauma, particularly the traumas that initiate migration. So instead, stories of trauma and migration long for happy scenes of hospitality and welcome, where a small slice of the huddled masses that are yearning to breathe free are welcomed and integrated into this host society. In other words, in this work, I explore how Ruth tells the story of modern migration and trauma, alert to matters of gender, late stage racial capitalism, and empire. So Before we know his name, we know that Elimelech has the means to migrate, or at least to travel and move his family. Readers of the Hebrew need to discern how they understand Elimelech as a ger, right? That Hebrew word ger, which has been variously translated. In the more modern translations, NRSV, CEB, and NIV, we have various synonyms of the word live, dwell, inhabit. Interestingly, the older version, King James Version, following in some ways, I think, the Septuagint, used the term sojourn. And that the Septuagint has this, I think, very vivid translation of transporting your house, para okemai. So readers may have understood that what he did is to get up and move. And take the household, physically, everything. Even if you want to imagine the physicality, you think that there's going to be a way within which he gets to Moab, architecturally, culturally, everything he's out of place. But this goes into a longer conversation that I've had, Kali, you have heard it, in my contestation between how we think about ger, whether as migrant or refugee, or all of the other legal categories that exist within our modern world. And then there is this also a very interesting phenomena of where you come from kind of determining how you're seen in the place you go. For instance, I find it very interesting. I don't know how you thought of yourself when you lived in the UK. People from the US will migrate, but never think of themselves as migrants in the place where they are. They use the word expatriates. I remember meeting a woman who lived in Mexico for near 20-something years, who got married, had children, owned property, and always thought of herself as an expatriate in Mexico. And she didn't get married to someone from the US, she got married to a Mexican, right? So inhabit that space. So it's, what I'm pressing against is when we start to position ourselves to read the book of Ruth, we have to be asking, which subject position are we reading from and we are encouraged and invited to read from, particularly within the confines of migration in the modern world. And whether we want to position ourselves from the underside of refugees who are forced to move. But anyway, Elimelech and his family are marked as outsiders in Moab, seems to play along, yes, okay, that. There are other important details in Elimelech's biography that prove important for the story. His wife, their sons. However, ancestral lineages and origins so subtly inserted in the outset will entrench Ruth within these larger biblical stories. Bethlehem in Judah, and the smallness of the clan of Ephrathah situates Elimelech in Davidic storylines and ties this book into what later readers will trace, rightly or wrongly, with messianic contours. So, but the outcome of the book leads to the stability of the Davidic genealogy in the closing verses. And that type of storytelling is what Peter Brooks, in Reading for the Plot, sees as the end determining the beginning, the middle of the stories. And that these ends, which he thinks are always serving the male libido, are about how you bring resolution and climax to a story in a satisfactory way that ties it off and stabilizes male expectations. 15 verses into the story is when we finally see Ruth as the subject of any sentence in the book. And that's when she offers this fulsome pledge to just get up and leave and be devoted completely to Naomi. In other words, that's the place where she becomes what Bonnie Honig regards as the model emigre. And that's the voice we hear initially from Ruth. So there are ways in which I find myself very uncomfortable talking about Ruth as a male story. And I hope, my hope is as I continue to work with this, and you hear me talk a little later, I am moderating that a lot more to foreground Ruth within this book. But that's part of the tension of when you're reading a literature that comes out of a highly patriarchal context. Gailey offers that if we reposition Ruth as the perpetual foreigner, it gives readers the opportunity to generate friction with the dominant narrative. And part of the tension occurs when Naomi, who captures the metaphor of fullness and emptiness, defines her existence. If you remember, when she gets back to Bethlehem, Naomi says, I left full, and I'm coming back empty. Now, of course, in doing so, Naomi channels the male values that have defined her life, okay? Because her fullness and emptiness has to be now around the presence and absence of men in her life. And it is in that narrative space that Ruth begins to shine, or at least to take on significance. The famine in Bethlehem sets the scene for other metaphorical famines in the book, and it parallels the migratory paths of the characters. They leave with the potential of men and generativity, and they come back without it. If Elimelech leaves Bethlehem because of a lack of bread, the outward journey contains the potential of male generativity. So they have, at least if you want to call it in the ancient world, they have seed that they take with them. And Naomi's sense that she left full reflects not the fate of other Bethlehemites at the time, some who couldn't leave, but it reflects her own family's potential. She left with the fullness of 3 virile men, capable of securing her and the heritage to which she was corrupted a strong future. And she acknowledges then her position. In these words, I think she's acknowledging then her position as guardian of those male values, and the one in which and the one in the book who would be the most active to ensure the preservation of those male lineages. Migration to Moab merely shifts the scene for this family. That's the way the story is told, because they seamlessly integrate into Moabite culture so well that they marry very easily into the culture without protest, without any kinds of anxieties that goes with intercultural marriages, and doing so, they in some ways ensure that the famine and its potential to deplete their life will not negatively affect them. And the rapid pace of the plot hides the details that this family draws upon, the fertility of Moab and the fertility of Moabite women, because it's the fertility of Moab, its ability to produce bread that sustains them when Bethlehem doesn't, and they marry the women with the potential to generate the family. So Elimelech no sooner exists in Moab, as the Hebrew puts it, before he dies, and then in the next sentence, his sons are marrying Moabite women, and according to the purposes of the narrator, this seems to be the function of the story: generativity and productivity for this family, because those purposes don't exist in Moab. Therefore, you could easily transfer yourself to another place to get it. And I think it's important for us to understand how the writer positions Bethlehem in a more superior position than Moab, which is a very interesting thing, that type of migration. Now, in any good storytelling, tension must exist to make it interesting. And so we get the tension very quickly in the first chapter, in the first few verses. There's a setback in the lives or death of the men are the causes for the tension in the book. Migration as movement through obstacles and setbacks as a trope appears other parts of the Hebrew Bible, particularly in the story of Abraham. As in that story of Abraham, who makes his way through foreign territory to establish himself, generativity is a major concern, because this is going to be the obstacle, one of the set of obstacles that Abraham is going to constantly confront until he could solve it himself, or until it resolves itself. And of course, note the different forms of generativity provided through different foreign women or different foreign alliances along the way for Abraham. So in Ruth, the plot demonstrates how migration and movement produces obstacles, but those obstacles are overcome only for new ones to emerge, and that kind of heightens the the issue. Death of Elimelech leads to the marriage of Ruth and Orpah to their sons, a 10-year marriage that produces no children, okay, which is intriguing in the ancient world. So with that comes all the suspense around fertility and whose infertility stands as a barrier. So much so, readers should be interested in this second migration of the family back to Bethlehem. The Moabite women who are valued in this story for their fertility. For most of the story, because we only meet them in verse 5, and by verse 6, they're 10 years into the marriage, and up until the end of chapter 1, that is in doubt. There has been no attempt to prove or disprove their fertility. So Naomi's declaration that when she returned to Bethlehem, she returns empty, despite having Ruth standing next to her, makes sense, because it may very well be that she might have doubts about her daughter-in-law's fertility. But the question notwithstanding, Ruth gives her the single possibility to perform her role as protector of her husband's heritage. Trauma and migration intersect when Ruth arrives in Bethlehem and performs the function of migrant labor, right? The kinds of performance we see all too well in different parts of the world today. This is space to go into that in greater detail. The provision in Deuteronomic law, generally seen as a benevolent gesture of welcome to people in precarious situations, enable Ruth a modicum of stability. But as Naomi soon shows, migrant workers occupy a tenuous position that offer no long-term chance of mobility. A foreign woman's migratory path, ironically, can come to a crashing and embarrassing end in the seasonal work of harvest gleaning. So the book hints at the possibilities of sexual exploitation in this position, but at the same time feels quite secure that the legal code solves the economic disparity that poor women will face. But since economics and sexuality intersect in very unusual or even all too common ways in a patriarchal context, the threshing floor in chapter 3 becomes the staging ground for the women to enact a pathway out of crushing poverty. Another kind of a migration that is happening there. But ultimately, what occurs in Ruth is a form of sexual exploitation that occurs under the cover of legal transactions. Now, the question as to who exploits whom need not occupy us too long, since the cries that Naomi's seduction plot forces Boaz into a marriage he might not have considered, might very well be true. But I think that's beside the point. The writer covers Boaz with sufficient ambiguity between chapters 3 and 4 to afford him plausible deniability as to what happens the night on the threshing floor, provide sufficient sexual titillation for male readers, and still make Boaz seem like the heroic rescuer that many modern interpreters view from when they read this text. But should we focus upon Boaz as the heroic figure who achieves fame through the stealth of the writer, we miss what the writer leaves out in order to craft this story of monarchy. To the extent that trauma exists in the book, it does so in the lives of men and the political economy of ancient Israel. Bethlehem suffers famine. A single family is forced to migrate. The men die. The family holds a potentially critical place in the clan, and ultimately the royal family life is threatened. A wealthy, unmarried, and perhaps childless man faces a moral crisis accompanied by an unexpected financial deal and so on and so on. You could pile up the different markers of trauma that the book wants us to pay attention to. But the writer makes readers aware of Judah and its needs while spending little time in Moab. The over 10-year sojourn in Moab comes to an end by verse 5 of chapter 1. Yet Moab migrates to Judah in the form of Ruth. So apart from the strategic gentilic to remind readers of her foreignness, Ruth lacks biography. Ruth lacks a background. Ruth lacks details. And most of all, she lacks an affective presence. So readers are aware of Naomi's pain, her emptiness, right, her fullness, right, all of that she experiences. And we are even aware that Boaz can be startled. But Ruth remains the empty canvas, or better, the vessel, whose reproductive potential ensures the generativity of ancient Israel and its monarchical line. You probably may have seen work from Musa Dube, who developed these letters between Ruth and Orpah as a means of filling the gap in the narrative gap that we have about who Ruth is and her experiences. But the gap reflects how trauma narration forecloses the imagination and reverts to the structures that privilege what seems like survival. Whatever trauma the writer of Ruth believes need to be told resolves itself through the bodies of foreign women, since foreign migrant women perform needed and necessary work. They remain unseen and unappreciated. As a character, Ruth remains peripheral to the male story that begins with Elimelech and whose ghost haunts the actions of his widow and determines the outcome of the plot. In this case, female reproductive labor raises the stakes because the crisis revolves around generativity, not an uncommon threat in the Hebrew Bible. But as the genealogical notice that ends the book indicate, this is not the first time that lineage was threatened and foreign migrant women's reproductive labor resolves a crisis. Go back to Rachel and Leah and who they brought in to do it. Go back to the Judah Tamar episode, which is all of the ones that the genealogy is hinting at. And so there's a sense in which it is proudly displaying these moments when foreign women were the ones who rescued the lineage. But the difference in this case is that the writer slows the pace of the story enough for readers to be aroused with ethnic and sexual stereotypes of foreign women. And although the stereotypes in this case are not all negative, they are all coded with economic value. Ruth, hardworking, a hard worker who applies herself from sunup to sundown. Ruth, loyal to her patron and dutifully follows her instruction. Ruth as open to sexual invitation and opportunity as she needs to be. So with these and other traits, Ruth provides a case for a liberal but controlled migration policy that does the appropriate sorting at the border, or at least a bordering country. The story of migration does not work well if everyone makes it across the border. And neither does the trauma narrative. Because the economies of empire prefer these losses and calculate the risks needed to ensure their perpetuation. The proud display of Ruth's contribution to the genealogy of David serves the writer well and provides the writer with suitable propaganda in a restive period when migration might be an answer to pressing crises, but not an answer that everyone wants to hear. But even more, empire's ability to hold together disparate people in a single entity remains one of its strengths. Empires, by definition, cannot be monocultural and would therefore need management techniques to sustain diversity. The Book of Ruth functions as in this self-congratulatory manner that Judah and all of its descendants can overcome its prejudiced past about the stories they have told about Moabites in Genesis and in Numbers and some other parts, depending on how you place these books in a historical context. Ruth gives that ability to rethink all of those prejudices and say we are no longer that, and we have become a different type of people. But Ruth also serves as evidence for those who are satisfying with saying, we were there, to point out that the outsider can sit in the seats of monarchical power and have a hand in shaping monarchical power. The genealogy, though, without the narrative, if you look at it, sanitizes the disruptive presence that many imagine exists when foreigners, outsiders, or unusual entrants appear in the story, because the genealogy will continue to be stories about men making children rather than the women who bear them. And in that way, genealogies can control the story. And in one sense, the story helps us to disturb those genealogies. But we can see how those who tell the stories try to mute those disruptive potentials. And so what that does is to open up spaces for us as modern readers to read around the edges of characters like Ruth, and to take as much as we possibly can in the places where they emerge to tell authentic stories of migration. Stories that will pay attention to loss and death and sacrifice, as such as the type that we see Ruth making, but to retell them in such a way that they are not co-opted into these larger narratives, because no doubt for Ruth, all she simply needed was to survive. She didn't want to become the grandmother of a king. And that idea of she should become the grandmother of a king is not her intent, nor the intent of many other people who just simply want a way to make it from one day to the next. So what if we interrupted and stopped the book of Ruth precisely where Ruth exits the stage? And all we hear is of a woman who was able to be helped by another man in a foreign country and had a child. And within the limits given to women in a patriarchal world, she survived and thrived beyond their wildest expectations. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Steve. We have a couple of minutes of questions, and there will be a break for tea.
Yeah.
So. Yes.
Very impressed by your reading of the book of Ruth from the perspective of the self-interest of the narrator. I think that's a powerful reading, and what's said, what's not said. You moved from that probably post-exilic Judean narrator to modern empires. And so I would just wonder whether we could reflect a bit more about that comparison in the book that isn't an empire. It's a kind of tribe, and there's a tribal perspective. Right? So are empires just giant tribes?
Yeah.
Not quite the same thing.
Yeah, I'm struck by your evaluation, and I think you're correct. So thank you for helping me see what I'm doing. Your word self-interest, I think, is important, and there may be ways within which we could think of empires as tribes, small because they're serving very narrow interests, even though they have to be expansive. So it's this way within which this sort of expansive territorial ideological apparatus is subsumed into a very, very narrow group, and in many ways, therefore tribal. I think that's a good way to think about it. I would not completely disagree, because the other piece about the empires is the preservation of a heritage. I think, but it's not preservation of a heritage in in a very slavish way. There's this openness about being innovative. So whatever the moment and the times require, let's do that innovation to keep the thing intact. And I think these are small stories. The heritage is a small story, whether the heritage is genetic rather is the word I want to use, or it is tradition in some very narrowly defined way, whether in religious or something else. How to mutate those across time will be an important thing. That would get
well, sheer wealth.
Yes.
That's a heritage.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Herman, yes.
Just on the empire, I think on the fact that it's one tribe, Judah is a tribe, isn't that always what an empire, it usually serves the center? An empire. I mean, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, when that broke up, Vienna was a much too large city for a small country. The German Empire, it was Prussia that formed the center. London for the British, and even today for the US, it's usually Washington that's served in that empire, and rather than the people.
So maybe if you could just sort of repeat, I don't think people heard the question, so just the question, just.
Yeah, as I'm understanding what you're asking is the way in which the empire serves specific geographical centers. Yes. Yeah, I think that is true to some extent, but the more and more we move into the modern world, that is less and less the case, where geography is not as a controlling concept as before, because there are ways within which now the geography can be diffused, and you no longer are limited by the geography. And in fact, even in the ancient world, the fairly successful empires were the ones that were able to replicate themselves outside of geographical centers. And I think that's one of the things to be very alert to, is the survivability of empires rests with its ability to innovate itself and do different things under different conditions.
Robert?
Thank you very much for what you presented. I was also struck by how you, towards the end, actually throughout, looked at this relationship between genealogy and narrative, and also in what ways Ruth's narrative, functions within the larger narrative of the book. And then towards the end, you ending, helping us to think, but what if we stopped at the end of Ruth's narrative? But in some ways, what you did is when you started out, you dwelt a lot on the kind of the beginning, before Ruth's narrative starts. So my question would just be, if we sort of also take your question towards the end and then ask, but what if we begin where Ruth's narrative begin? Because you included then that introductory part is very important for the way you situated it. So I'm just thinking of you.
Right. Well, that's intriguing, and if we do so, it's in some ways. I mean, if we could be imaginative. I mean, like what Musa Dube is doing, we could be imaginative and try to fill in what we don't have. If we stick with the book, then it's more or less in chapter 2, where Ruth arrives in Jerusalem and on her own, in some ways, is negotiating, trying to glean. So that I think presents some interesting opportunities. Yeah. Thanks for raising that. I mean, like I said, I found myself being dissatisfied about the work I was doing, in the sense that I don't want to then become the type of person who says, oh wow, we don't have any feminist book, we don't have any books about women, and here's the reason why, because even Ruth, that's a man's book. So there's a part of me that wants to resist that, and that what you're suggesting is a way out of that dilemma.
Good. I think we're going to break for tea. Thank you so much. Yes, for those online also. So we'll be back in Yeah, so at 10, so yeah, it's now, I think we are running about 10 minutes late. So 10 to 10, so, and then we, 10 to 11, sorry.
Okay.
10 to 11, so a half an hour tea. Thank you.